April of 1865 was a month of paradoxes. The guns of the Civil War had largely fallen silent. The Confederate armies had crumbled, surrendering one after another. Yet the air in Washington, D.C. was heavy, not with celebration, but with cautious uncertainty. The streets were alive with the murmurs of victory, but beneath the surface lay a city on edge, a nation fragile and scarred. Lincoln, sitting in the Oval Office, knew that the war's end was only the first step. Healing a divided country would be far harder than any battlefield triumph. The president's figure was tall and gaunt, his face lined by sleepless nights and endless responsibility. Mary Todd Lincoln, perched at his side, could see the weight pressing upon him. His eyes, though weary, still held a spark, a mixture of determination and sorrow. He listened intently as his advisers debated the next steps for Reconstruction, carefully weighing the needs of a country desperate for peace against the risks of punishment and revenge. The room was thick with tension. Every word carried the potential to shape the nation's future. Lincoln's voice, calm yet deliberate, cut through the arguments, reminding everyone that reconciliation, not vengeance, must guide their actions. Outside, Washington moved with a peculiar rhythm. Soldiers, still in their uniforms, patrolled the streets. Shops were reopening after years of scarcity. Families tentatively ventured out, some smiling at the promise of peace, others wary, their faces haunted by what they had lost. The city had become a mosaic of hope and anxiety, and no corner of it was untouched by the enormity of the past years. But in the shadows of this fragile calm, another figure was stirring. John Wilkes Booth, famous actor and Southern sympathizer, moved through the city with purpose. His charm made him beloved by theatergoers, but beneath the laughter he elicited on stage simmered a deadly anger. Booth could not forgive Lincoln. To him, the president was a tyrant who had destroyed the Southern way of life, whose hands were covered in the blood of soldiers and civilians alike. Every newspaper clipping, every report of Lincoln's speeches or decrees fueled Booth's conviction that a single act could strike a blow for vengeance, for justice as he defined it. Booth's conspirators, men drawn from the same fervent Southern allegiance, met in dimly lit rooms, whispering in corners and making meticulous plans. Their faces, hardened with desperation, reflected the enormity of what they intended. They would strike at the very heart of the Union, and Booth, confident in his skill and daring, would play the leading role. Even among them, a flicker of doubt sometimes appeared, but Booth's charisma and intensity left little room for hesitation. He convinced them that their act would alter history, that it would avenge a South that had been humiliated and defeated. Meanwhile, the city itself was alive with obliviousness to the storm about to descend upon it. Lanterns glowed along cobblestone streets, casting golden reflections in puddles left by a recent spring rain. Children ran between the legs of their parents, laughing, chasing dreams of chocolate and small joys that had been in short supply during wartime. Street vendors hawked oranges and bread, their cries blending with the distant clip-clop of horses' hooves. Life, it seemed, was attempting to resume its normal rhythm. Yet on the evening of April 14th, there was a certain electricity in the air, a tension that no one could quite name. At Ford's Theater, a comedy titled Our American Cousin was scheduled to open. Its reputation promised levity and laughter, a welcome distraction for a city long dominated by grim news of war and political struggle. Tickets had sold out, and patrons arrived in elegant coats and bonnets, eager to enjoy a rare night of entertainment. Among them were members of the government, prominent citizens, and ordinary families seeking comfort and shared amusement. In a private box above the stage sat the president and his wife, accompanied by Major Henry Rathbone and Clara Harris, a couple invited to join the Lincolns for the evening. The box itself was lavishly decorated, draped in rich velvet curtains and adorned with flowers. It was a place of both honor and security, a space where Lincoln could relax, however briefly, in the midst of a city still under the shadow of war. Mary Lincoln, ever attentive, whispered about the play, hoping to coax a smile from her husband. Lincoln, despite the burden he carried, allowed himself a quiet chuckle at the performances below, his deep voice blending with the murmur of the audience. Yet even in moments of levity, his thoughts strayed to the challenges ahead. Reconstruction, the care of freedmen, the reintegration of the South, the fragile economy, all weighed heavily on him. The laughter of the audience seemed a fragile shield against the storm of responsibility pressing down upon him. Beyond the theater, Booth prepared. Dressed in dark clothes, his movements purposeful, he navigated the alleys and side streets with the precision of a man who believed destiny was on his side. Every step was measured, every pause calculated. In his mind, he was not merely a man committing a crime. He was an instrument of history, poised to strike at the very heart of the Union. As evening deepened, the lights inside the theater glowed like a beacon of ordinary life. Outside, the streets began to empty as citizens settled in for the night, unaware of the shadow slipping closer or of the tragedy that would soon befall them. In the presidential box, Lincoln adjusted his coat, leaning slightly toward Mary, offering a small, reassuring smile. It was a simple gesture, yet one that captured the quiet dignity of a man who carried an entire nation on his shoulders. The stage below shimmered with candlelight and activity, the actors oblivious to the drama about to unfold above. The audience laughed at the antics on stage, sharing in a brief respite from the cares of a wounded nation. And then, somewhere beyond the laughter, beyond the applause, a plan silently approached its inevitable climax. The city held its breath, unknowingly teetering on the edge of a tragedy that would leave the nation stunned, grieving, and forever changed. History, poised in the wings, was about to take a turn none could have imagined. The theater buzzed with life as the audience settled into the evening performance of Our American Cousin. Candles flickered against the ornate walls, casting shadows that danced across the faces of eager spectators. Children fidgeted with excitement. Soldiers, fresh from the front, whispered quietly, sharing stories of battles that had recently ended. Above the stage, in the presidential box, Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln sat alongside Major Henry Rathbone and Clara Harris. The president's tall, imposing figure contrasted with his gentle, almost boyish smile, a rare expression of relief after years of turmoil. For a few brief hours, he was just a man enjoying a play with those he cared about, unaware of the storm creeping ever closer. Downstairs, the actors performed with exaggerated gestures and comic timing, the laughter of the audience rising like a tide. Every chuckle seemed to reinforce the fragile sense of normalcy that Washington so desperately craved. Booth, meanwhile, moved like a shadow above the theater. His dark eyes scanned the room, a mix of determination and anticipation sharpening every line in his face. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, and now every detail fell into place with terrifying precision. At precisely 10:15 p.m., as the scene reached its comic climax, Booth made his move. He slipped silently through a side door and ascended the narrow stairway to the presidential box. The laughter below momentarily masked the danger, a cruel irony in a night destined for tragedy. Booth entered the box with a fluid motion, his presence unnoticed until the final moment. Then, without hesitation, he raised his pistol, aimed at the president, and fired. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, echoing off the ornate walls and silencing the laughter in an instant. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Shock froze the spectators as the reality sank in. Something unimaginable had occurred. Lincoln slumped forward, blood staining his face, his tall frame now fragile and vulnerable. Mary Todd screamed, clutching her husband as Major Rathbone attempted to seize Booth, only to be slashed by the assassin's dagger. Booth, shouting a triumphant cry of vengeance for the South, leapt from the box to the stage below. The audience watched in horror as the actor-turned-assassin landed with a theatrical flourish, disappearing into the shadows behind the theater. Panic erupted. People screamed, some fleeing for the exits, others frozen in disbelief. The curtain of reality had been ripped away, revealing a nightmare none could have anticipated. In the presidential box, chaos reigned. Mary Todd held Lincoln's head in her lap, her tears streaming down her face as she cried out for help. Rathbone staggered from the wound inflicted by Booth's dagger, his blood mixing with fear and rage. Attendants rushed to the box, their faces pale under the glow of candlelight, desperately trying to comprehend what had just occurred. The president's breathing was shallow, and every moment carried the weight of impending doom. Lincoln was lifted from the box and carried across the street to the Peterson House, a modest boarding house illuminated by flickering lamps. The parlor, lined with simple furniture and wooden floors, became the epicenter of a tragedy that would reverberate across the nation. Doctors hurried to the scene, their faces grim as they examined the president. They were calm, but their eyes betrayed the hopelessness of the wound. A single bullet had penetrated his brain. Despite their best efforts, there was no chance of survival. Outside, the city had begun to stir with rumors. Whispers traveled along cobblestone streets and through shadowed alleys. "The president has been shot," someone shouted. Horses neighed nervously, carriage wheels screeched, and the first of the city's watchmen ran toward the scene. The news spread like wildfire, carried on the wind by panicked messengers and frightened citizens. Washington, a city already on edge after years of war, now trembled under the weight of a new horror. Inside the Peterson house, time seemed to slow. Lincoln's face, usually composed and thoughtful, was now still, marked by the finality of death in progress. Mary Todd sobbed quietly, her hand clutching his, unwilling to let go even as the doctors worked. The room was suffused with tension, a mixture of grief, disbelief, and helplessness. Every tick of the clock was a reminder that the nation's leader, the man who had guided the Union through its darkest hours, was slipping away. Meanwhile, authorities mobilized. Soldiers and police scoured the city, searching for any trace of Booth. Carriages clattered over cobblestones as men raced from one theater and alley to the next, determined to capture the assassin who had brought the nation to its knees in a single moment. Street lamps flickered in the darkness, casting long shadows as the city plunged into fear and uncertainty. No one knew where Booth had gone or what the next act of this tragedy might be. The news reached every corner of the country within hours. Newspapers scrambled to report the event, headlines screaming of horror and disbelief. Citizens who had hoped for peace now faced a new reality. Their president was dead, struck down at a moment when the nation had dared to hope for healing. Communities paused, as if the earth itself had stopped turning, mourning the loss of a leader whose presence had defined their lives for years of war and turmoil. In the presidential box, empty now except for the echoes of chaos, the silence seemed deafening. The velvet curtains swayed slightly in the breeze, and the laughter from the stage, which had just moments before filled the room, was gone. It was as if the theater itself mourned, holding its breath for a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. The night wore on. Lincoln, unconscious and gravely wounded, remained under the care of doctors. Mary Todd never left his side, whispering prayers and promises that she knew he could not hear. Outside, Washington streets were alive with commotion. Soldiers patrolled, messengers ran, and citizens gathered in small clusters, exchanging frantic reports and piecing together fragments of the shocking news. As midnight approached, the gravity of the situation settled over the city like a suffocating shroud. The man who had held the Union together, who had endured personal loss and national chaos to guide the country through its darkest days, hung in the balance.
A nation that had dared to hope for peace was now forced to confront the fragility of life and the unpredictability of history. In the shadows beyond the theater, Booth disappeared into the night. His heart raced with the exhilaration of a man who believed he had struck a decisive blow, yet even he could not know the consequences that would follow, consequences that would touch every corner of the nation, leave a scar on the collective consciousness, and cement the events of April 14, 1965, as one of the most devastating nights in American history. The world outside had not yet caught up to the personal tragedy unfolding in the Peterson house. Inside, the doctors worked tirelessly, though their efforts were doomed from the start. The president, the symbol of hope and unity, lay poised between life and death. And though the streets of Washington would continue to hum with activity and the theater lights would dim, nothing would ever be the same again.
By the early hours of April 15, 1865, the unthinkable had solidified into undeniable reality. Abraham Lincoln, the tall, solemn figure who had carried the Union through 4 years of unrelenting civil war, had died. The news traveled like wildfire, leaping from the lamp-lit streets of Washington to distant towns and farms, from bustling cities to quiet hamlets. Americans everywhere paused, as if the pulse of the nation itself had faltered. The sorrow was immediate, deep, and overwhelming. In the streets of Washington, the first wave of grief erupted quietly but with force. Citizens gathered at intersections, clustering in the dim glow of lanterns, whispering the words no one wanted to speak aloud. "The president, he's dead." Shopkeepers shuttered their doors midday, hands trembling, eyes red from sleeplessness and shock. Soldiers in uniform lowered their heads as they passed, a mix of duty and despair weighing heavily on their shoulders. Even those who had not supported Lincoln felt the sting of loss. His leadership, his vision, his presence, it was a pillar of the nation now abruptly removed. At the White House and across government buildings, officials moved in stunned silence. Cabinet members, some barely recovered from the exhaustion of wartime decision-making, now faced the unimaginable task of maintaining order while grief threatened to consume them. They debated in hushed tones, their conversations punctuated by the distant wails of citizens outside. Messages were dispatched to the states, urging calm, but the impact of Lincoln's death was already seeping into every home, every community. In the heart of the city, the Peterson house had become a sanctuary of sorrow. Mary Todd Lincoln refused to leave her husband's side, her hands still clasped over his chest even after he had passed. The doctors who had tried in vain to save him now stood silently, their faces etched with fatigue and helplessness. Major Rathbone, recovering from the slash of Booth's dagger, sat pale and trembling, haunted by the violence he had witnessed. Within the small parlor, grief and horror coalesced into a palpable, almost tangible presence. The funeral preparations began almost immediately. Lincoln's body was carefully laid in state in the Capitol Rotunda, draped in somber black and white, illuminated by flickering torches and the cold light of morning. Lines of citizens stretched through the halls, some stooped in exhaustion, others weeping openly, their hands clutching the walls for support. People from all walks of life filed past the casket, politicians and generals, freedmen and soldiers, women and children. Each gaze upon the fallen president was heavy with the weight of loss and reverence, a silent testament to the profound impact he had left on the nation. News of the assassination, however, brought not only grief but anger. John Wilkes Booth had vanished into the night, leaving behind a trail of fear and uncertainty. Authorities mobilized with unprecedented urgency. Soldiers scoured the streets, homes were searched, and rumors of accomplices spread quickly, heightening the tension that already gripped Washington.
The hunt for Booth became a citywide obsession. Citizens were asked to report suspicious activity, and every darkened alley and quiet street became a potential hiding place for the man who had shattered the nation's sense of security. The mourning extended far beyond the city's limits. In New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and every state capital, bells tolled in sorrow. Public buildings flew flags at half-mast, and churches rang their steeples in long, mournful peals. Communities gathered in town squares and meeting halls to hear the news and share their grief. Some cried openly, others stood in silent reflection, their hearts heavy with disbelief. Families huddled together, recounting Lincoln's speeches, remembering his presence, and wondering how the country could endure such a loss. Newspapers captured the nation's anguish in stark, solemn headlines. "The president is dead," declared the National Intelligencer. "A nation in tears," screamed the New York Times. Reports of Lincoln's funeral train, which would carry his body across multiple states for public viewing, filled the papers. Citizens eagerly awaited the chance to pay respects, lining the tracks and raising black banners in silent tribute. Across the country, the sorrow was collective, a shared acknowledgement of the vacuum left by Lincoln's passing. In Washington, the hunt for Booth escalated into a desperate, tense pursuit. The assassin had vanished into Virginia, but authorities believed he was aided by co-conspirators, men whose loyalty to the Southern cause made them dangerous and unpredictable. Military patrols searched rivers, forests, and towns. Carriages rattled over cobblestones as officers and detectives interrogated citizens, seeking any clue to Booth's whereabouts. Rumors of sightings and hidden allies circulated rapidly, heightening both fear and determination. Inside the homes of Washington, grief was intimate and raw. Women clasped their children, weeping quietly, their minds haunted by the events they had witnessed or heard of. Soldiers remembered the president who had guided them through battles, his calm voice a source of reassurance amid the chaos of war. Children, too, young to understand fully, felt the absence of a leader they had seen on currency, in portraits, and in stories told by their parents. Lincoln's death was not just a political loss, it was a wound that cut through the heart of every American community. Despite the sorrow, the nation began to rally. State and federal authorities coordinated security measures while planning for the president's funeral. Volunteers assisted in lining the streets for the funeral train. Citizens contributed in small but meaningful ways: flags, candles, flowers, and black ribbons. Even in grief, Americans sought to honor their fallen leader, to give expression to the profound loss they all felt. Mary Todd Lincoln's grief became a symbol for the nation, her pain mirroring the collective mourning. She remained at the president's side for days, her presence a reminder that the tragedy was deeply personal, not just political. Letters poured into the White House from citizens offering condolences, each word echoing the sense of loss that swept across the continent. As the sun set over Washington, the city was cloaked in solemnity. Candlelight glimmered through windows, the streets were quieter than usual, and the sounds of normal life were subdued. Citizens paused to remember a man who had embodied perseverance, humanity, and hope in the darkest hours of their nation. Across the country, whether in bustling cities or quiet rural towns, the grief was unanimous. The nation had lost its leader, and the wounds inflicted would take generations to heal. Yet amid the sorrow, a glimmer of resolve emerged. The country understood that Lincoln's vision of unity and freedom could not die with him. People whispered of continuing his work, of rebuilding the Union and honoring the ideals for which he had fought. The nation mourned deeply, yes, but in that grief was also the seed of determination, a quiet promise to carry forward the legacy of a man who had shaped the very soul of America. Even as Washington braced for the hunt for Booth and the unraveling of a dangerous conspiracy, the country's mourning was collective and profound. Lincoln had become more than a president. He had become a symbol of endurance, empathy, and hope. And in the grief that enveloped the nation, the people recognized that the path forward, fraught with peril, uncertainty, and sorrow, would require courage and unity like never before. History had marked April 14th, 1865 as a turning point. The nation would remember not only the tragedy of Lincoln's death, but also the extraordinary grief and solidarity that followed. Washington's streets, now heavy with mourning citizens and vigilant soldiers, mirrored the wider country, a nation in tears, yet unwilling to surrender to despair.
The nation's streets remained heavy with tension, even days after the assassination. Soldiers patrolled tirelessly, their boots clattering on cobblestones, rifles slung over shoulders, eyes scanning every darkened doorway, every shadow. Washington was on edge, a city haunted not only by grief, but also by the knowledge that Lincoln's killer had vanished into the night. John Wilkes Booth, once celebrated as an actor with charm and flair, had transformed into the most hunted man in America. The manhunt extended across the countryside. Rivers, forests, barns, and villages were searched with relentless intensity. The government offered rewards for information, and ordinary citizens became reluctant participants in a drama they had never imagined. Every report of a stranger, every rumor of Booth's whereabouts fueled a mix of fear, hope, and anger. The public, though mourning, demanded justice, a swift and decisive response to the man who had struck at the very heart of their nation. Meanwhile, in a small Virginia barn, the pursuit finally came to a climax. Booth had been cornered, surrounded by Union soldiers who had tracked him for days. His co-conspirator, David Harold, was with him, and the barn became a tense theater of fate. Booth, desperate and defiant, refused to surrender. Flames were set to the structure to force him out. As smoke and chaos filled the night air, Booth moved through the barn, a final desperate figure clinging to the illusion of freedom. A single gunshot rang out. Booth collapsed, lifeblood staining the wooden floor. His rebellion against the nation ended in a cloud of smoke and flame. Justice, at last, had been served, but the tragedy it had followed remained etched in the nation's soul. The capture and killing of Booth did not end the ripple of consequences. Federal authorities arrested his co-conspirators, men who had aided or abetted the plot. Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, and David Harold faced trial in a military commission. Their proceedings were widely reported, filling newspapers with accounts of loyalty, betrayal, and political intrigue. Some were executed, others imprisoned, each outcome carrying the weight of both justice and the lingering question of morality in a nation struggling to heal. The trials were not just legal events, they were a public reckoning, a symbolic effort to restore order and affirm the rule of law after a crime that had shaken the foundations of the country. As the nation absorbed the shock, it also began to honor its fallen president. Lincoln's body was transported on a funeral train across multiple states, allowing thousands to pay respects. In Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, Chicago, and numerous towns, citizens lined the tracks, hats in hand, faces solemn as the train passed. Black crepe draped every railing and post. The nation itself seemed cloaked in mourning. People whispered stories of Lincoln's speeches, his compassion, and his vision for unity. Children who had only heard his name in stories now saw the coffin, realizing in an instant that history was no longer a distant abstraction, but a painful living reality. At the White House, Mary Todd Lincoln retreated from public view, consumed by grief that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The death of her husband had transformed her world into a place of solitude and sorrow. Yet even in mourning, the country looked outward, beginning the immense and arduous task of reconstruction. Lincoln's death did not halt progress, it crystallized the nation's awareness of the fragility of freedom and the preciousness of leadership. Citizens who had mourned now found themselves tasked with carrying forward the ideals he had fought to protect. The political landscape, too, was reshaped. Vice President John Johnson assumed the presidency, inheriting the monumental responsibility of guiding the nation through Reconstruction. Johnson, a Southern Democrat loyal to the Union, faced both criticism and expectation. Congress and citizens alike scrutinized every decision, seeking assurance that Lincoln's vision of unity and freedom would endure. In many ways, the country's mourning became intertwined with vigilance. Grief inspired a determination to ensure that Lincoln's legacy would not be squandered. In the years that followed, Lincoln's assassination became a defining moment in American memory. Monuments were erected, most famously the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, a towering symbol of a man whose ideals had transcended death. Schools, books, and stories preserved his speeches and his deeds, reminding citizens of the courage and wisdom he had brought to a nation at its darkest hour. Historians, writers, and ordinary Americans reflected on the paradox of his life and death, a leader who had preserved the Union yet was taken violently before he could oversee its healing. Lincoln's image, immortalized in photographs, engravings, and portraits, became a moral compass for the country. Citizens saw in him a symbol of resilience, compassion, and the enduring struggle for justice. His assassination, while a tragedy, reinforced the sacredness of democratic ideals and the responsibilities of leadership. In the grief that followed, Americans understood that the nation was larger than any single individual, yet the impact of that individual, Lincoln, was profound and timeless. The consequences of April 14, 1965 rippled through generations. Families told the story of the president who had guided a country through war, the actor who had betrayed it, and the resilience of citizens who had refused to be broken by tragedy. Monuments, books, and commemorations ensured that Lincoln's name remains synonymous with unity and moral courage. Even the darkest night of assassination could not eclipse the light of a legacy forged in perseverance and vision. In the quiet moments, one could imagine Lincoln's presence lingering in the halls he had walked, in the fields he had saved, in the hearts of citizens who had lived through the Civil War and its aftermath. April 14, 1865 remained a date of sorrow, but also a reminder that the ideals of freedom, justice, and unity, once sown, could survive even the most violent interruption. The nation's tears would eventually dry, but their memory and the memory of Lincoln himself would endure. History, ever watchful, marked the event as a turning point, not just in politics, but in the consciousness of a people. The tragedy of Lincoln's assassination reminded every generation that leadership carries profound responsibility, that freedom must be defended, and that even in moments of despair, the vision of a united, resilient nation could never be extinguished. And so, a nation in tears began the long journey toward healing, carrying the lessons of grief, courage, and hope into a future that would be forever touched by the life and the death of Abraham Lincoln.